In the summer of 1942, the Pacific Ocean stretched like a battlefield without end. 6 months had passed since Pearl Harbor, and the Japanese Empire stood at its greatest height. From the jungles of Burma to the coral atolls of the Central Pacific, its red sun flag flew over an empire larger than Hitler's in Europe. Tokyo's armies had swept through Malaya, the Philippines, and the Dutch East Indies with astonishing speed. But deep in the Solomon Islands, one small and largely unknown island was about to challenge that tide: Guadalcanal. For centuries, the island had been forgotten by history. Covered in dense jungle, steaming swamps, and volcanic ridges, it was home to fewer than 10,000 Melanesians living in scattered villages. Few maps even marked it correctly. Yet its location was critical. Lying along the sea lanes between the United States and Australia, Guadalcanal was the hinge of Allied communication in the South Pacific. Whoever controlled it would dominate the surrounding seas and skies. In May 1942, Allied reconnaissance flights spotted something disturbing. Japanese engineers were clearing jungle on Guadalcanal's northern coast, near a place called Lunga Point. It was an airfield, still unfinished, but once completed, it would allow Japan's long-range bombers to threaten the vital shipping route between the US and Australia. To the Allied command under Admiral Chester Nimitz, that was unacceptable. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, America would go on the offensive. The plan was audacious. The newly formed 1st Marine Division, led by Major General Alexander Vandegrift, would land on Guadalcanal and seize the airfield. It would be the United States' first major amphibious operation of World War II. But preparations were rushed. Intelligence was sketchy, maps were outdated, and many Marines had never seen combat. Still, the moment had come to strike before Japan could fortify its new base. At dawn on August 7, 1942, the calm waters off Guadalcanal erupted. Over 80 Allied ships, cruisers, destroyers, and transports opened fire, blasting the shoreline. The noise was deafening. For the men aboard the landing craft, it felt like the entire world was shaking. Then came the order: land the landing force. The Marines surged ashore. Expecting heavy resistance, they instead found silence. The Japanese construction crews, about 2,500 men, had fled into the jungle, leaving behind bulldozers, tools, and food still cooking on stoves. It was an eerie, almost anticlimactic landing. By nightfall, American troops controlled the beachhead and the half-built airstrip. They quickly renamed it Henderson Field in honor of a Marine pilot killed at Midway. But if the landing was easy, the battle for the island would not be. For the Japanese High Command, Guadalcanal was a shocking intrusion into what they considered their defensive perimeter. Tokyo could not allow an American airbase so close to Rabaul, their major stronghold to the north. Orders went out immediately: the invaders must be destroyed. Within days, troops from Japan's elite special naval landing forces began to mobilize to retake the island. Meanwhile, on the beaches of Guadalcanal, the Marines faced their own crisis. On August 9th, just 2 days after the landing, the Allied fleet suffered a devastating blow. In the night waters off nearby Savo Island, a Japanese cruiser force ambushed the American and Australian escorts, sinking 4 heavy cruisers in less than an hour. The sea turned to fire. Over 1,000 sailors died. Terrified of further attack, the remaining U.S. Navy ships withdrew, taking with them most of the supplies. The Marines were left stranded, low on ammunition, fuel, and food, with an unfinished airfield and the jungle closing in around them. Rain poured for days. Malaria-bearing mosquitoes filled the air. At night, the sound of movement in the dark hinted at the unseen enemy drawing near. The Japanese soldiers, trained for jungle warfare, began to probe the American lines. The first serious clash came on August 21st when a force of 900 Japanese under Colonel Ichiki Kiyonao launched a frontal assault across the Ilu River, known to the Marines as the Tanaru. Screaming "Banzai," they charged straight into American machine gun fire. By morning, nearly all of Ichiki's men were dead. It was the first major Japanese defeat on land in the war, and it stunned both sides. Yet for every Japanese unit destroyed, more were coming. Reinforcements streamed down from Rabaul on board fast destroyers that the Americans would soon nickname the Tokyo Express. On night, they raced through the narrow waters north of the island, unloading men and supplies before dawn. Each morning, American air patrols hunted the remnants. Each night, new ships appeared on the horizon. The Marines dug in around Henderson Field, building crude bunkers from sandbags, coconut logs, and wrecked bulldozers. Every ration was precious. Every round of ammunition counted. Pilots of the Cactus Air Force, a motley group of Marine, Navy, and Army flyers, began operating from the rough airstrip, fending off Japanese bombers and attacking the nightly convoys. Their planes were battered and their fuel scarce, but their presence kept Guadalcanal in American hands. By late September, the island had become a place of endless tension. The heat, the insects, and the constant threat of attack wore the men down. They called it the Island of Death. For the Japanese soldiers, too, the jungle was merciless. They landed with little food, expecting a quick victory. Instead, they found themselves starving, weakened by disease, and cut off from reliable supply lines. Yet neither side would give up. Guadalcanal was no longer just another island. It had become the test of wills that would decide the future of the Pacific War. By the time September came, both armies knew one thing: this was not a small operation anymore. It was a struggle of endurance. Man against man, machine against jungle, empire against empire. The United States had begun its first true counteroffensive of the war. Japan, for the first time, was fighting to hold what it already claimed. The next 6 months would turn this forgotten island into one of the most important battlefields in modern history. By September 1942, the calm of Guadalcanal had vanished. What had begun as a quick American raid had now become a grinding, full-scale struggle for control of the South Pacific. Both sides poured everything they could into the fight: soldiers, ships, and aircraft, yet neither could fully dominate the island. For the men on the ground, the war was no longer about strategy. It was about survival. The Japanese command in Rabaul, led by General Hyakutake Harakichi of the 17th Army, was stunned by the loss of the airfield at Lunga Point. To Tokyo, Guadalcanal was more than just a patch of jungle. It was the forward line protecting the empire's southern flank, the bridge between their bases in the Pacific and their newly conquered territories in Southeast Asia. If the Americans held the island, they could threaten Japan's entire defensive perimeter. Determined to reclaim it, Hyakutake assembled his forces. The first reinforcements to reach the island were remnants of the Ichiki detachment, whose earlier attack at the Tanaru River had ended in disaster. The Japanese army refused to believe that an entire elite force could have been wiped out by green American troops. They assumed Ichiki's men had simply been overrun by overwhelming numbers. That arrogance would cost them again. On August 31st, a second major Japanese force, about 6,000 men of the Kawaguchi Brigade, landed east of the marine perimeter. Their orders were simple: attack at night, destroy the enemy, and retake Henderson Field. The Japanese plan relied on stealth and coordination, traits they had perfected in earlier campaigns. But on Guadalcanal, the dense jungle, poor communication, and the sheer exhaustion of the men would shatter those expectations. In the Marine camp, life was equally miserable. Supplies were running dangerously low. With the Navy reluctant to risk its ships near the island after the disaster at Savo, food deliveries were irregular. Marines joked grimly about their diet of rice and beans, when they had anything to eat at all. Malaria swept through the ranks. Uniforms rotted in the humidity, and rifles rusted overnight. The men worked in silence, knowing that every night could bring another attack. The Japanese came quietly, often moving barefoot to avoid making noise. At night, Marines would hear faint whispers in the jungle, then sudden firegrick. Snipers lurked in the trees, and stray soldiers disappeared without a trace. The island itself seemed to conspire against both sides. The heat was suffocating. Rain fell in relentless sheets, turning foxholes into swamps. The jungle's thick canopy made navigation almost impossible. Many Japanese units lost their way before even reaching the front. Then, in mid-September, the storm finally broke. On the night of September 12, Colonel Kiyonao Kawaguchi launched a massive coordinated assault on the American lines. His 3,000 men, split into several groups, advanced toward the ridge south of Henderson Field, a position held by about 800 Marines under Lieutenant Colonel Merritt "Mike" Edson. The Marines had been using the ridge as a defensive outpost, a natural line of high ground overlooking the airfield. To the Japanese, it was the key to victory. The first wave came in total darkness. Flares lit the night sky as Japanese soldiers charged up the slope, screaming battle cries. The Marines fired until their machine guns overheated, then threw grenades down the hill. The air was filled with smoke, screams, and the thunder of automatic fire. The attackers kept coming, again and again, hurling themselves into the crossfire. By dawn, the ridge was littered with bodies. But the Japanese were relentless. The next night they came again. Exhausted and nearly out of ammunition, Edson's Marines fell back to a secondary line. Hand-to-hand combat erupted in the jungle, bayonets flashing in the moonlight. It was chaos, men firing at shapes in the dark, officers shouting over the roar of battle. Finally, at first light, Marine dive bombers and artillery pounded the hillside, breaking the final Japanese push. When the smoke cleared, over 800 Japanese lay dead. The Marines had held. Henderson Field remained in American hands, and the survivors of Kawaguchi's force melted back into the jungle. For the Japanese command, it was another bitter lesson. Their tactics, brave but inflexible, could not overcome well-prepared defenses backed by artillery and air support. Still, Tokyo refused to accept defeat. The emperor's staff in Tokyo and General Hyakutake at Rabaul believed the Americans were weak and underfed. They assumed that one more large-scale effort would crush them completely. Orders went out for a renewed offensive. Reinforcements began assembling across the Solomon chain. Every night, destroyers of the Tokyo Express dashed through the waters north of the island, unloading men and supplies under the cover of darkness. The Marines could only watch helplessly from the shore as enemy ships came and went. In the skies above, the struggle for air superiority continued daily. From their crude strip at Henderson Field, the Cactus Air Force fought a desperate, almost continuous campaign. Their planes, Wildcats, Dauntlesses, and P-400s scrambled at dawn to intercept Japanese bombers from Rabaul. Dogfights filled the sky, with pilots often returning to base in damaged aircraft or not returning at all. The wrecks of downed planes littered the airfield's perimeter.
silent reminders of the cost of holding Guadalcanal. By late September, both armies were worn thin, but neither side would yield. The Japanese still controlled the seas at night. The Americans held the skies by day. In between, the island remained a no-man's land of mud, death, and disease. Every soldier, American or Japanese, lived with the same dread that the next night the jungle would come alive with fire. In Washington and Tokyo, the battle for Guadalcanal was still seen as a sideshow. But for the men who fought there, it was total war, a test of endurance, faith, and willpower. Every hill and stream became a battlefield, every tree a fortress. The campaign that had begun with confidence on both sides was turning into a brutal, unending nightmare. And as autumn came to the Solomon Islands, both nations began to realize something they hadn't before. Guadalcanal was no longer just a military objective. It was a symbol of the wider Pacific struggle, the moment when Japan's advance would either resume or begin to fall back forever.
By early October 1942, Guadalcanal had become the center of gravity for the entire Pacific War. What had begun as a small American invasion had drawn in the full weight of the Imperial Japanese Army and Navy. The stakes were now enormous. Both sides knew that control of one rough airstrip, Henderson Field, would determine who ruled the skies and the seas between Hawaii and Australia. Every decision, every supply convoy, every life now revolved around that strip of coral and mud. For the Americans, Henderson Field was more than just a base. It was their lifeline. From its rutted runway, the Cactus Air Force operated day and night, flying patrols, intercepting bombers, and striking at Japanese ships. The pilots, often exhausted and malnourished, slept beside their aircraft, ready to scramble at a moment's notice. Many were veterans of Midway and Coral Sea, but Guadalcanal was different. Here, there was no rotation, no rest, only the constant strain of survival. Each morning, the Marines braced for the same grim routine. From the north came the drone of engines, Japanese bombers from Rabaul, escorted by agile Zero fighters. The air raid sirens would wail, and the Cactus pilots would leap into their planes, racing down the strip as bombs began to fall. The air battles were brutal and close. Ammunition was scarce, and spare parts almost non-existent. Mechanics cannibalized wrecks to keep a handful of planes in the air. Every mission was a gamble. Yet despite these hardships, Henderson Field held firm. Its existence prevented the Japanese Navy from operating freely by day. Their supply convoys, forced to travel at night, were harassed constantly and often destroyed at dawn. For Japan, this was intolerable. Guadalcanal had to be retaken, and soon. The Imperial General Staff planned a new offensive for October. This time, they would commit their largest ground force yet, nearly 20,000 men under General Masao Maruyama. They would strike from the south and west, converging on the American perimeter in a coordinated assault. The Japanese believed that the Marines were weak, starving, and demoralized. In truth, the Americans were exhausted, but not broken. On the night of October 13, the Japanese began their preparations with one of the most intense bombardments of the war. Two battleships, Kongo and Haruna,
escorted by cruisers and destroyers, approached the island under cover of darkness. For more than an hour, they shelled Henderson Field with nearly 1,000 heavy shells. The bombardment tore the airfield apart, planes destroyed, fuel tanks burning, men killed in their sleep. When morning came, Henderson Field looked like a graveyard. But the runway, somehow, remained usable. The Marines worked furiously to repair it, and by the next day, fighters were again taking off to meet incoming bombers. The Japanese believed the bombardment had crippled the defenders. Confident of success, Maruyama's troops began their march through the jungle toward the airfield. What looked like a short distance on the map, less than 15 miles, turned into an ordeal. The terrain was a nightmare: dense jungle, steep ridges, and knee-deep mud. Rain fell constantly. The soldiers carried heavy packs and little food. Many collapsed from exhaustion before even reaching the starting point of their attack. Meanwhile, on the American side, General Vandegrift's intelligence officers intercepted Japanese messages that hinted at a major offensive. The Marines strengthened their defenses along the southern perimeter, where a series of ridges and gullies formed a natural barrier. Artillery was dug in, barbed wire laid, and machine gun nests concealed among the trees. The men had learned from the earlier battles. This time, they would not be caught unprepared. The attack began on October 23rd. Japanese infantry, emaciated and soaked, advanced in the dark. They expected to surprise the Americans, but the jungle betrayed them. The sound of snapping branches and shouted orders gave away their position. Marine flares illuminated the night as machine guns opened fire. What followed was chaos: explosions, tracer rounds cutting through the rain, men fighting at point-blank range. Maruyama's plan called for 3 coordinated assaults, but communication between units broke down almost immediately. Lost in the jungle, groups attacked separately, often running headlong into fortified Marine positions. Those who reached the lines fought with extraordinary courage, charging through barbed wire and into gunfire. But the results were disastrous. By dawn, the ground before Henderson Field looked like a graveyard. But the Japanese attacks continued over the next 2 nights, each wave weaker than the last. American artillery rained shells on the jungle approaches, while the Cactus Air Force struck retreating columns during the day. By October 26th, the Japanese offensive had collapsed. Of Maruyama's 20,000 men, more than 3,000 were dead or missing. The rest staggered back through the jungle, starving and sick. The Americans had held their ground. But victory came at a terrible cost. The Marines were running on the edge of endurance. Food supplies were down to a few days' worth. Malaria infected half the men. Casualties mounted daily. Yet morale somehow remained unbroken. The men knew they had achieved something extraordinary. They had repelled one of Japan's largest ground offensives with minimal naval or logistical support. For the Japanese command, Guadalcanal was becoming a nightmare. Every attempt to retake the island ended in catastrophe, but they could not admit failure. The Emperor's army had never abandoned a battlefield. Tokyo ordered yet another reinforcement, promising new ships, new troops, and a final, decisive assault. The Americans, meanwhile, reinforced their own position. In mid-November, new army units began landing, replacing some of the exhausted Marines. Fresh food Ammunition and medical supplies arrived under heavy escort. For the first time since August, the defenders could breathe. Yet they knew the battle was far from over. The Japanese Navy still prowled nearby, ready to strike again. As the rains of November began, both sides prepared for what they knew was coming. One more brutal clash for control of the island. The men of Guadalcanal could sense it. The outcome of the entire Pacific War might soon be decided in the mud and jungle around one single airfield that refused to die.
By November 1942, Guadalcanal had become the deadliest square of ocean in the Pacific. The waters north of the island, once serene and empty, were now littered with twisted steel, the graveyard of ships and sailors from both sides. The Americans called it Iron Bottom Sound, a name that would soon earn grim justification. Each night, the sea came alive with flashes of gunfire and the thunder of explosions. Japanese destroyers, swift, silent, and deadly, prowled under the cover of darkness, bringing supplies and reinforcements in what the Marines grimly nicknamed the Tokyo Express. They raced down from Rabaul, unloaded men and food under moonlight, and sped away before dawn, often leaving behind nothing but wreckage and oil fires. For the Americans, these nightly raids were torment. They could hold the island by day, but the sea belonged to Japan at night. Every sunrise revealed new shell holes, burned aircraft, and shattered positions. Henderson Field survived, but only just. In early November, intelligence reports revealed the Japanese were preparing a massive convoy, their largest yet, carrying more than 7,000 troops and heavy equipment for a new offensive. To cover this landing, the Japanese Navy planned to send in battleships to once again bombard Henderson Field into oblivion. If they succeeded, the airfield and the American foothold on Guadalcanal would be lost. Admiral William Bull Halsey, now commanding the South Pacific, understood the stakes. He had few ships left after months of brutal fighting, but he ordered every available vessel to intercept the Japanese. "We're going in," he told his staff, "no matter the odds." On the night of November 12, 1942, the first phase of what would be called the Naval Battle of Guadalcanal began. American cruisers and destroyers, under Admiral Daniel Callahan, steamed through the dark waters of Iron Bottom Sound. They knew the Japanese were near, but radar, still primitive at the time, gave only vague bearings. The night was pitch black, with low clouds and rain. The sea smelled of oil and cordite. Every man on deck was tense, waiting for the first flash of light. At 1:24 a.m., the enemy appeared. Not just destroyers, but battleships. The He and Kirishima, two of Japan's finest, loomed out of the darkness like steel giants. The Americans had sailed straight into them. What followed was chaos, a close-range naval brawl so savage that sailors later called it a barroom fight after the lights went out. At ranges of less than 2,000 yards, ships fired point blank. Shells tore through hulls, flames lit the sky, and destroyers rammed each other in the confusion. Admiral Callahan's flagship, San Francisco, was hit repeatedly. Callahan himself was killed at his command post. The Atlanta was ripped apart by friendly fire and enemy shells. Yet the Americans kept fighting. The battleship He took dozens of hits from torpedoes and gunfire. When dawn came, she was a burning wreck, later sunk by American aircraft. The cost was terrible. The U.S. lost 2 cruisers and 4 destroyers, with over 1,400 sailors dead. But the Japanese bombardment had failed. Henderson Field was still there, battered but alive. The next day, November 13th, the Japanese sent in their transports. 11 ships loaded with soldiers and supplies, escorted by cruisers and destroyers. American aircraft from Henderson Field attacked relentlessly, sinking or crippling several transports. But that night, the Japanese came again, another battleship force, determined to finish what the first could not. This time, Admiral Willis Lee led the American defense, commanding the battleships Washington and South Dakota, veterans of the Atlantic, now facing their first real test in the Pacific. As the Japanese ships approached, radar aboard the Washington picked them up, a decisive advantage. At 11:17 p.m., the great guns of the Washington opened fire, hurling 16-inch shells into the night. Each shell weighed nearly a ton. The Kirishima, the pride of the Imperial Navy, was hit again and again. Within minutes it was ablaze, her decks torn open, her crew abandoning ship. The South Dakota, meanwhile, suffered electrical failures and was pounded by Japanese fire, but she survived. When dawn broke, Kirishima slipped beneath the waves, the second Japanese battleship lost in as many days. For the first time since the war began, American battleships had met and defeated their Japanese counterparts in night combat, the Imperial Navy's supposed specialty. It was a turning point. But the sea was not yet finished claiming lives. On November 14th, the surviving Japanese transports tried one last desperate dash to Guadalcanal. By daylight, they were easy targets. American aircraft from Henderson Field and the carrier Enterprise fell upon them like hawks. 7 of the 11 transports were sunk. The rest beached themselves to unload what little they could. Most of the supplies, food, ammunition, medicine, burned in the surf. Thousands of Japanese soldiers came ashore with empty rifles and no rations. Their enrichment had become a death sentence. The naval battle of Guadalcanal cost both sides dearly. More than 40 ships sunk, over 7,000 sailors dead. But it ended Japan's dream of retaking the island. Their navy, bloodied and broken, withdrew north. From that moment on, Japan would never again send major warships into the waters off Guadalcanal. The Americans had seized the initiative and would never let it go. For the men on the island, the aftermath was surreal. The ocean, once alive with fire and fury, was now eerily quiet. The beaches were littered with wreckage, twisted metal, lifeless bodies, drifting crates of rice and ammunition. The Marines walked among it all, silent, exhausted, knowing they had witnessed something historic. That night, as the sky darkened over Henderson Field, the sound that replaced gunfire was the distant hum of American planes, still flying, still guarding the island. The men understood what it meant. Guadalcanal had been held. The waters of Iron Bottom Sound shimmered under the moonlight, hiding beneath their surface the remains of 100 ships and thousands of souls. The battle for Guadalcanal turned the tide of the Pacific War, but at a price so heavy that survivors would remember it for the rest of their lives. By December 1942, Guadalcanal was no longer the fierce battlefield of tanks, ships, and explosions. It had become a war of endurance. The front lines had stabilized, the great naval battles subsided, but the suffering of the men on both sides only deepened. The island itself was a relentless enemy. The tropical heat was suffocating. Mosquitoes swarmed in thick clouds, spreading malaria that struck men down faster than bullets. The rain came in endless sheets, soaking foxholes, rusting weapons, and turning the ground into sticky mud that clung to boots and skin alike. For the American Marines, the victory at sea had not yet brought comfort. Supplies were still scarce. Henderson Field was operational, but food was rationed, and fresh water came from polluted streams. They ate canned meat and stale crackers when they had them, sometimes half-rotten rice salvaged from abandoned Japanese camps. Every night, men huddled in their foxholes, listening to the distant cries of the jungle and the faint rumble of enemy artillery. The Japanese had it far worse. Cut off from resupply by American air and sea power, thousands of soldiers were now stranded in the island's interior, hungry, sick, and dying. What had begun as an elite invasion force was deteriorating into a starving army. They called it the Island of Death. By December, Japanese rations had completely run out. Soldiers lived on coconuts, roots, and whatever insects or frogs they could catch. Some boiled their belts and leather boots to extract nutrients. Others collapsed on the jungle trails, too weak to continue, their comrades forced to leave them behind. Disease, malaria, dysentery, beriberi, tore through the ranks. The once proud imperial army, which had conquered half of Asia, was now decimated by hunger and exhaustion. American patrols often found their bodies lying along the trails, thin, skeletal, clutching empty canteens or faded photographs from home. It was a slow, invisible massacre, waged not by bombs or bullets, but by isolation. On the American side, the toll was immense too. Malaria hit almost every man at least once. The 1st Marine Division, after 6 months on the island, was no longer a fighting unit, but a collection of feverish, emaciated survivors. By Christmas, many weighed less than 130 pounds, their faces hollow, their uniforms in tatters. Despite the misery, the Marines tried to hold on to their humanity. They built crude Christmas trees from palm fronds, decorated them with cartridge casings and scraps of tinfoil. Chaplains led small services under the swaying trees, their voices drowned by the hum of insects and distant thunder. One Marine wrote in his diary, "We have no turkey, no gifts, no lights, but we're still alive, and that's enough." For the Japanese, the same night brought only silence. Their commanders still ordered attacks, but the soldiers could barely lift their rifles. Desperation drove them to night raids, crawling through the grass toward American lines, often collapsing before reaching them. Those who survived the fighting were captured, hollow-eyed, trembling, starving. The Marines who saw them were shocked. They didn't look human anymore, just bones wrapped in rags. By January 1943, Japan's high command faced a grim reality. The Imperial Navy could no longer supply Guadalcanal. Every attempt to deliver food ended in disaster. Convoys bombed, destroyers sunk, supplies burned on the beaches. The Emperor's generals began to admit what had once been unthinkable: the island was lost. In Tokyo, the decision was made to evacuate the surviving troops. The mission was codenamed Operation K, a secret withdrawal disguised as another reinforcement effort. Between January 14th and February 7th, 1943, under the cover of darkness, Japanese destroyers crept down the slot, ferrying out the remnants of their shattered army. In just over 3 weeks, they managed to rescue about 10,000 men, barely half of the original force. More than 25,000 had died from combat, disease, and starvation. When the Americans realized what was happening, it was already too late. The evacuation was executed with such precision that many believed Japan was preparing for another assault. Only when reconnaissance flights found empty camps and abandoned positions did the truth emerge. The enemy was gone. The battle for Guadalcanal was over. The announcement reached the Marines in early February. There were no cheers, no parades, just quiet relief. They were too tired to celebrate. Many stared across the beaches where so many had died and said nothing. For months they had fought, suffered, and endured on a tiny patch of jungle most Americans had never heard of. Now, at last, it was theirs. In Washington, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt called Guadalcanal a turning point in the war. For the first time, Japan had lost territory it had once conquered. The myth of the invincible Japanese army was shattered. From then on, the Pacific War would move steadily toward Japan, island by island, mile by mile. But for those who survived, Guadalcanal was more than a victory. It was a memory burned into their bones. The stench of rot, the buzz of mosquitoes, the endless rain, the sight of friends buried in shallow graves. It was hell, one Marine wrote years later, but it was the place where we learned how to win. The island, once covered in jungle and death, began to grow quiet again. The rusted hulks of ships still lay beneath the waves of Iron Bottom Sound. The wrecked planes remained scattered across the airfield, their metals slowly consumed by the sun and salt. The jungle reclaimed everything. Guadalcanal had cost both sides more than they ever imagined. Yet from its muddy trenches and burning skies emerged the first true shift in the balance of the Pacific. The tide of war had turned, and the long road to Tokyo had begun. When the guns finally fell silent over Guadalcanal in February 1943, the world's attention shifted to the next battles. But for those who studied the campaign, its lessons would shape the rest of the Pacific War. Guadalcanal was not just a victory, it was a teacher. It exposed every weakness, every assumption, and every flaw in both the American and Japanese war machines. For the United States, it was the first major test of its new global war effort, a test it barely passed. When the Marines first landed in August 1942, America was still reeling from Pearl Harbor and the early disasters of the war. Its navy was stretched thin, its army inexperienced, its logistics system unprepared for jungle warfare thousands of miles from home. Guadalcanal revealed all of this, brutally. Supplies were the first great challenge. Everything, food, fuel, ammunition, even drinking water had to be shipped across the Pacific, offloaded under fire, and hauled through mud to the front. At one point, the Marines ran so low on rations that they survived on captured Japanese rice and coconuts. This experience transformed American military logistics. What followed was a revolution, the creation of vast supply networks that could move men and materials with industrial precision across the ocean. By 1944, those same systems would power invasions on scales the Japanese could never match. Communications and coordination were another painful lesson. Early in the campaign, the U.S. Navy and the Marines often operated as separate forces, with poor coordination and conflicting priorities. The Navy withdrew after heavy losses, leaving the Marines isolated on the island. It was a near disaster and a wake-up call. From then on, joint operations became the standard. The Navy, Army, and Marine Corps learned to fight as one, supported by air power, logistics, and intelligence working in harmony. Air superiority, too, took on new meaning at Guadalcanal. The struggle for Henderson Field proved that air control was the key to survival in the Pacific. Whoever controlled the skies controlled the island. The American Cactus Air Force, a mix of Marine, Navy, and Army pilots, operated under impossible conditions: muddy runways, damaged planes, and constant enemy raids. Yet they learned how to fight the Zero, how to coordinate with ground forces, and how to strike Japanese shipping. These lessons laid the groundwork for the massive carrier battles that would define the later war. Perhaps the most important change, though, was psychological. Guadalcanal shattered the myth of Japanese invincibility. For 8 months, the Imperial Army had been considered unbeatable, disciplined, fearless, unstoppable. But at Guadalcanal, American troops faced them head-on and won. The Japanese soldier was still fierce, still dangerous, but he was no longer invincible. The Marines learned that determination and firepower could overcome fanaticism. On the Japanese side, the lessons were harsher. Guadalcanal was their first real defeat, and one they struggled to understand. Tokyo's generals had underestimated America's industrial power and will to fight. They had assumed that once Japan struck hard, the United States would negotiate peace. Instead, they found a nation that refused to yield. Their logistics had failed catastrophically. Their navy, though skilled and aggressive, could not sustain prolonged operations. They had no system for large-scale resupply over long distances. The Tokyo Express, those daring night runs by destroyers, was heroic but futile. Each trip delivered only a fraction of the food and ammunition needed. Men starved while supplies burned offshore. Their command structure, too, was rigid and divided. The Army and Navy barely cooperated, often acting as rivals rather than allies. The Army demanded reinforcements. The Navy refused to risk its ships. Messages were delayed, intelligence ignored. By the time Tokyo understood the situation on the ground, it was too late. The Americans had already built defenses that could not be broken. Culturally, Guadalcanal was devastating. The Japanese warrior ethos, the belief in death before dishonor, collided with the brutal reality of modern war. Thousands died not in glorious battle, but from disease and hunger. Many officers refused to report these failures honestly, fearing disgrace. This denial would haunt Japan's war strategy until the very end. For the Americans, the campaign also reshaped leadership. Admirals like William Bull Halsey and Raymond Spruance learned the value of boldness balanced by caution. Commanders on the ground like Major General Alexander Vandegrift proved that calm, steady leadership could hold men together through unimaginable stress. These were not glamorous victories. They were hard lessons learned in mud, rain, and blood. The psychological toll on both sides was immense. Marines returned home haunted by what they'd seen: the constant bombardment, the disease, the faces of starving enemies. Some wrote about it, most stayed silent. The Japanese survivors, too, carried their trauma quietly, their stories often suppressed or forgotten in post-war Japan. Yet out of that suffering emerged a new kind of warfare, one built on adaptation. The U.S. military studied every aspect of Guadalcanal: the tactics, the logistics, even the psychology. Manuals were rewritten, new jungle training centers established, and new equipment designed. Lighter packs, better radios, improved medical supplies. The Pacific islands that followed, Tarawa, Saipan, Iwo Jima, were fought with the lessons of Guadalcanal in mind. The campaign also marked a turning point in the way Americans viewed the war. Until then, the Pacific had seemed distant, almost abstract. But the reports from Guadalcanal, the heroism, the horror, the victory, gave the public a tangible symbol of resistance. Newspapers called it the first offensive of the new America. In Japan, by contrast, Guadalcanal was buried under censorship. The government announced it as a strategic withdrawal. Few citizens knew how catastrophic the defeat was. Yet among the soldiers and sailors who survived, the truth was unmistakable. Japan had met an enemy that could not be intimidated. By the spring of 1943, the Pacific had entered a new phase. The Americans held Guadalcanal, Tulagi, and the surrounding Solomon Islands. From there, they began the long, methodical push north, towards Rabaul, the Marianas, and eventually the Philippines. Guadalcanal had been a small island, but its impact was vast. It changed the way wars were fought, proving that control of the air, sea, and supply lines mattered more than sheer bravery. It turned green recruits into veterans and a hesitant nation into a global power. The island's jungles would grow quiet again, its beaches overgrown with vines, its wrecks slowly sinking into the sea. But beneath those waters, the story of Guadalcanal lived on. A story of chaos turned to order, of defeat turned to learning, and of men who faced the impossible and endured. For America, Guadalcanal was not the end of the struggle. It was the beginning of understanding how to win it.
The victory at Guadalcanal in February 1943 was not an ending, it was a beginning. For 6 long months, the United States had fought a desperate battle for survival in the Pacific. When it ended, the myth of Japanese invincibility was gone, and a new phase of the war had begun, one where the Allies would take the offensive, step by step, island by island, across a vast ocean. In the months following the Japanese evacuation, the Americans consolidated their hold on the Solomon Islands. Engineers expanded Henderson Field, transforming it from a battered dirt strip into a major Allied air base. From there, long-range bombers and reconnaissance planes began striking northward toward Japanese strongholds, Bougainville, New Georgia, and finally, Rabaul, the massive fortress base that anchored Japan's South Pacific defense line. Rabaul had once been considered impregnable. Carved into volcanic rock, it held airfields, shipyards, and tens of thousands of troops. But Guadalcanal had shown that America didn't need to storm every fortress head-on. Instead, the Allies adopted a new strategy: island hopping. They would bypass heavily fortified positions, seize key islands nearby, and isolate the rest. Starved of supplies and air cover, the Japanese garrisons would wither on the vine. This strategy was born directly from the lessons of Guadalcanal: the importance of logistics, the power of air control, and the futility of wasting lives on every patch of ground. It was a cold, calculated form of warfare, one that turned the Pacific's geography into a weapon. Throughout 1943, this new strategy took shape. The U.S. Navy and Marine Corps launched operations across the Solomons, supported by Australian and New Zealand forces. The fighting was brutal. Jungle-covered islands, swamps, and reefs turned every advance into a nightmare. But unlike before, the Americans now had the tools and the experience to fight effectively. Supply lines were efficient, air cover constant, and medical care far improved. Each victory brought the war closer to Japan. The capture of New Georgia in August 1943 cut off Rabaul's southern approaches. In November, landings on Bougainville further isolated the Japanese base. Allied aircraft then began a relentless bombing campaign against Rabaul, reducing it from a proud naval bastion to a hollow shell. By early 1944, the once feared Japanese stronghold was useless. Its ships sunk, its airfields cratered, its garrison trapped. The tide of war had truly turned. Guadalcanal had also reshaped the minds of commanders.
Admiral Chester Nimitz, leading the Central Pacific Drive, and General Douglas MacArthur, advancing from the southwest, now coordinated their campaigns to encircle Japan's empire from two directions. It was a vast, synchronized assault, the largest naval campaign in history. And at its core was the quiet confidence learned from Guadalcanal, that with determination, organization, and control of the skies, even the most entrenched enemy could be defeated. For Japan, the loss of Guadalcanal marked the beginning of a long, irreversible decline. Their navy had suffered too many irreplaceable losses: ships, pilots, and above all, time. Industrially, they could not compete. Every American victory brought new airfields, new supply bases, and fresh reinforcements. Every Japanese defeat left them more isolated, more exhausted. But Japan did not surrender. Their soldiers fought on with the same ferocity that had defined Guadalcanal, defending every island, every cave, every inch of ground. They were bound by a code that refused retreat or surrender, a mindset that made every future battle a bloodbath. But the Americans had changed. The fear that had gripped them in 1942 was gone. They had faced the best of Japan's forces and survived. The Marines who had once crouched in muddy foxholes at Henderson Field were now veterans, teaching new recruits how to fight, how to endure, and how to win. By late 1943, the Pacific War Front stretched across thousands of miles, from the Aleutian Islands in the north to New Guinea in the south. New American carriers, cruisers, and battleships poured into the theater. The industrial might of the United States was now fully mobilized, a tide Japan could never hold back. The lessons learned at Guadalcanal became doctrine. Every invasion afterward, Tarawa, the Marshalls, the Marianas, Iwo Jima, was planned with logistics first. Airfields were seized early. Naval support was constant, and medical evacuation routes were established before the first boots hit the beach. The chaos of the early months of Guadalcanal would never be repeated. Even in Washington, Guadalcanal had changed minds. It proved that the Pacific could not be treated as a secondary theater. The sacrifices of those Marines, sailors, and soldiers had shown that Japan could be beaten, but only with full commitment. Resources began to flow in greater numbers. New carriers were launched monthly, new divisions trained, new aircraft produced by the thousands. Meanwhile, in Tokyo, the shock of defeat was met with denial. Official reports described the withdrawal as a planned redeployment. But privately, Japanese officers knew the truth. Guadalcanal was the moment they lost the initiative, the first crack in an empire built on expansion. Admiral Hirosuke Yamamoto, who had once masterminded Pearl Harbor, now saw that Japan's path led only one way, backward. In April 1943, he was killed when American codebreakers intercepted his flight plans, another sign that Japan's advantage in secrecy and surprise was gone. By mid-1944, American bombers from captured islands were within striking distance of the Japanese homeland. The men who had fought on Guadalcanal could hardly recognize the scale of the war that they had helped to shape. What had begun as a desperate defense of a single jungle airstrip had grown into a continental campaign, a march across the Pacific toward the heart of Japan itself. Yet even as new battles raged, Guadalcanal remained a symbol. It was there where the balance had shifted, where fear gave way to resolve and uncertainty turned to momentum. Veterans of the campaign carried that pride for the rest of their lives. They had been there when the tide turned, when America stopped retreating and started advancing. Years later, historians would call Guadalcanal the place where the road to Tokyo began, and for good reason. Every victory that followed, Every flag raised on every captured island could trace its lineage back to those first desperate days in 1942 when a handful of Marines and sailors refused to yield. The war in the Pacific still had years to run, bloody years filled with unimaginable battles. But after Guadalcanal, the outcome was no longer in doubt. The Empire of Japan had reached its high water mark. The tide was rolling back, and it would not stop until it reached the shores of Japan itself.
By early 1944, the Japanese stronghold of Rabaul stood as a symbol of both strength and futility, a fortress without purpose, an empire's clenched fist that could no longer strike. Once the most formidable base in the South Pacific, Rabaul had been the beating heart of Japan's expansion. Its airfields had launched the raids on Guadalcanal. Its harbors had teemed with destroyers, cruisers, and transports feeding the empire's advance. Now, Rabaul was silent. American and Australian forces had not taken it by storm. They had done something far more devastating. They had made it irrelevant. After the brutal lessons of Guadalcanal, the Allies had embraced a new kind of warfare, one that relied on precision, patience, and power. Instead of throwing men at Japan's strongest points, they had chosen to surround them, to strangle them, to cut off their lifelines until even the proudest garrisons withered away. Rabaul was the ultimate example. In November 1943, the Allies launched Operation Cartwheel, a massive, coordinated campaign designed not to capture Rabaul, but to isolate it. American Marines landed at Cape Gloucester on New Britain. Australian troops advanced from the south through the jungles of New Guinea. Meanwhile, air forces from newly captured Bougainville and the Solomons began a relentless bombardment of Rabaul itself. The Japanese defenders had prepared for an invasion that never came. They had built bunkers, laid mines, and filled the skies with anti-aircraft guns. But the Americans and Australians simply went around them. Every new airfield captured reduced Rabaul's reach. Every convoy sunk starved it further. By early 1944, the fortress that had once housed over 100,000 Japanese soldiers and airmen was effectively cut off from the world. Supplies dwindled, disease spread. Planes sat rusting on airstrips with no fuel to fly. From the air, Rabaul became a daily target. B-24 Liberators and B-25 Mitchells pounded its docks and airfields with methodical precision. On February 19, 1944, the once proud fortress suffered one of the heaviest air raids of the Pacific War. Over 500 Allied aircraft swarmed over the base, dropping thousands of tons of bombs. Fires raged for days. The Japanese garrison could do nothing but endure. They dug deeper, built underground hospitals, and rationed supplies. Yet their enemy no longer saw them as a threat, only as a waste of resources. The shadow war around Rabaul became a slow-motion collapse. The Japanese Imperial Navy, once the terror of the Pacific, could no longer protect its outposts. Convoys bringing food or ammunition rarely arrived. When they did, Allied submarines were waiting. For the first time in the war, Japan's troops were not just fighting the enemy, they were fighting hunger, malaria, and despair. General Hitoshi Imamura, commander of the Japanese 8th Area Army stationed at Rabaul, kept a diary through these dark months. His entries reveal a man trapped by circumstance and loyalty. He wrote in March 1944, "We have become ghosts. We remain soldiers, but our war has ended. Only Tokyo has not yet realized it." Rabaul became a tomb, not of bodies, but of belief. As the Allied advance surged forward, bypassing island after island, Japan's empire began to collapse in slow motion. The same strategy that strangled Rabaul was now applied across the Pacific, to Truk, to Palau, to the Marianas. The Americans had discovered a new truth. They didn't need to destroy everything. They only needed to render it useless. For Japan, this was the most devastating revelation. Their entire war strategy had been built on fortifications, on defending every captured island to the last man. They had assumed that the Americans would fight them head-on, wasting lives against walls of steel and concrete. Instead, the Americans simply went around those walls and cut off the defenders inside. This approach had another effect. It preserved Allied lives while draining Japan's strength. Every garrison left behind was a prison camp in disguise, filled with soldiers who could no longer influence the war. By mid-1944, the Allies were already looking beyond Rabaul. Their eyes were set on the Marianas, Saipan, Tinian, and Guam. Islands close enough to bring the Japanese homeland within range of American bombers. The men who had fought and survived Guadalcanal would soon find themselves part of a vast machine of war that stretched from California to the Philippines, from the factories of Detroit to the skies above Tokyo. For the Japanese soldiers trapped inside Rabaul, the war would drag on in silence. Cut off from news, food, and hope, they remained at their posts until the very end. When Japan finally surrendered in August 1945, some of them wept, not from relief, but from disbelief. They had been forgotten, left behind by the empire they had sworn to defend. The story of Rabaul was not of glorious battle or heroic last stands. It was the story of a war that had outgrown its soldiers, of an empire that had failed to understand the scale of the enemy it faced. In the end, Rabaul was both fortress and grave, a monument to Japan's lost ambition, and a warning to all who believed that courage alone could overcome the weight of industry, intelligence, and time. The guns of Rabaul would never fire again, but their silence told the story of a world that was changing, a world where warfare had become total, and victory belonged not to those who fought the hardest, but to those who could fight the longest.
By 1944, the war in the Pacific had become more than a struggle of armies. It was a contest of nations, of resources, and of sheer industrial will. The United States had transformed itself into something the world had never seen before, a nation that could wage war on every ocean and still feed, clothe, and arm half the planet. The transformation had not come easily, nor quickly. Only a few years earlier, in the late 1930s, America had been a country still recovering from the Great Depression. Its factories built cars, radios, and refrigerators,
not bombers or tanks. Its military ranked 17th in the world, smaller than Portugal's. The idea of fighting a global war on two fronts would have seemed absurd. Yet, within months of Pearl Harbor, that same peaceful nation became a machine of war. When President Franklin D. Roosevelt called upon America to become the arsenal of democracy, he wasn't speaking in metaphors. He was issuing a command to 130 million people, a challenge to transform peacetime industries into engines of destruction. And they answered. Across the nation, factories roared to life. The Ford Motor Company, once famous for its Model T, began producing B-24 Liberator bombers at its Willow Run plant in Michigan. At its peak, the factory rolled one bomber off the assembly line every 63 minutes. Henry Ford's engineers had applied the assembly line principles that revolutionized automobiles to the construction of heavy bombers, and the result was staggering. In California, Douglas, Lockheed, and North American Aviation filled the skies with aircraft, from nimble P-51 Mustangs to mighty B-29 Superfortresses. Women riveters, immortalized by the iconic Rosie the Riveter poster, replaced men who had gone to war, proving that America's strength came not just from its machines, but from its people. Steel mills in Pittsburgh worked around the clock, their furnaces glowing red against the night sky. Shipyards along the coasts turned out Liberty ships faster than submarines could sink them. At the height of production, one new Liberty ship was launched every 3 days, each one carrying food, fuel, and ammunition across oceans filled with danger. Factories that once built toasters now made machine guns. Typewriter companies made rifle parts. The entire economy had been mobilized for one purpose: victory. This was total war, American style. The scale of it defied imagination. Between 1941 and 1945, the United States produced 300,000 aircraft, 100,000 tanks, 2.6 million machine guns, and over 41 billion rounds of ammunition. No empire in history had ever possessed such industrial reach. And behind every number was a human story. A family working double shifts, a farmer buying war bonds, a young woman in a welding mask shaping the hull of a destroyer. By 1943, American production had surpassed that of all the Axis powers combined. Japan could not match it, nor could Germany, whose factories were being bombed into rubble. The arsenal of democracy was not merely supplying its own forces, it was also arming Britain, the Soviet Union, China, and dozens of other nations through the Lend-Lease program. Ships carrying American-built weapons and food crossed the Atlantic in endless convoys. Soviet soldiers fought the Battle of Stalingrad with American trucks, boots, and canned meat. British pilots flew American-made P-51s over Berlin. Even the French resistance relied on radios and explosives made in Chicago and New Jersey. America was not just fighting the war, it was powering it. But this immense industrial surge came with new challenges. Managing such vast production required unprecedented coordination between government and business. Washington created new agencies, the War Production Board, the Office of Price Administration, and the War Manpower Commission to control materials, labor, and prices. The government decided what could be built, how much it would cost, and who would build it. For the first time, the lines between industry, government, and the military blurred. Generals met with factory managers, engineers worked alongside strategists,
The American war machine became a partnership. Capitalism and central planning fused together for a single cause. And while the factories roared, America itself changed forever. Millions of women entered the workforce for the first time. African Americans moved north and west to fill industrial jobs, sparking both opportunity and tension. Entire cities sprang up around defense plants. In California, the population exploded as workers poured in to build ships and aircraft for the Pacific Campaign. The war was reshaping not just the world map, but the American way of life. By 1944, this industrial might had become a weapon more powerful than any fleet or army. When American troops stormed island after island in the Pacific, they did so with overwhelming firepower, tanks, flamethrowers, aircraft, and artillery in quantities the enemy could scarcely imagine. Japan, once confident in its warrior spirit, now faced an enemy that could replace every loss, every plane, every ship, every soldier, faster than Japan could destroy them. In the skies over the Pacific, the results were devastating. Waves of bombers, escorted by long-range fighters, darkened the horizon. Japanese airfields were bombed day after day until nothing remained. For every Zero Japan built, America built 10 Hellcats. For every destroyer sunk, 2 more replaced it. This was industrial warfare at its purest, not a contest of courage, but of endurance. General Douglas MacArthur once said, "The war will be won not by brilliant strategy, but by the relentless application of power." And nowhere was that power more evident than in America's factories. Even in the midst of total war, American workers broke production records month after month. Strikes were rare, morale was high, and patriotism filled the air. Posters reminded citizens that their labor was a weapon. "The man behind the gun is the man behind the hammer," one read. By 1945, the arsenal of democracy had done more than arm a war. It had redefined what a modern nation could achieve when united by purpose. From the assembly lines of Detroit to the shipyards of Seattle, from the coal mines of Pennsylvania to the airfields of California, a single idea had taken root. That freedom itself could be built, rivet by rivet, on the factory floor. And as those factories continued to thunder, across the ocean, the empire of Japan was beginning to crumble, not because its soldiers had lost their will to fight, but because its nation could no longer sustain the war. The skies over Tokyo were darkening, and soon the full weight of America's industrial power would descend upon Japan itself.
By the beginning of 1945, the United States had pushed across the Pacific, island by island, building airfields on Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, each one a launching pad for the most powerful bomber ever built, the B-29 Super Fortress. These sleek, silver giants were unlike anything that had flown before. They could reach altitudes of 30,000 feet, fly more than 3,000 miles, and carry 10 tons of bombs. For Japan, already weakened and isolated, the appearance of these bombers meant that the war was coming home. The Pacific no longer protected the Japanese homeland. From newly captured islands, the B-29s could now reach Tokyo itself. The first raids began cautiously. Precision bombing was the theory. Factories, steel mills, and military depots were the targets. But high-altitude bombing proved unreliable. Winds over Japan, known as the jet stream, a discovery new to meteorology, scattered bombs miles off target.
Bombs aimed at aircraft plants fell on rice fields. Whole missions failed to hit anything of value. General Curtis LeMay, a hard, relentless commander from Ohio, decided to change tactics. He believed that precision bombing was a fantasy, and that only overwhelming destruction could end the war. In early 1945, he ordered a new campaign: low-altitude, nighttime incendiary raids on Japan's cities. The target was not just factories, but the infrastructure of war, the workshops, warehouses, and workers' homes that kept Japan's industry alive. On the night of March 9, 1945, nearly 300 B-29s took off from the Marianas. Each carried bombs fueled with jellied gasoline, napalm. Their target, Tokyo. The first wave dropped magnesium flares to mark the city. Then came the firebombs. Within minutes, the capital was an inferno. Wooden houses, packed close together, burst into flames. The wind turned the fire into a hurricane. Streets melted. Canals boiled. Thousands of civilians tried to flee, but the fire moved faster than they could run. When the sun rose, 16 square miles of Tokyo were gone. Over 100,000 people were dead, more than in Hiroshima or Nagasaki later that year. It was the deadliest air raid in human history. The bombing continued night after night. Nagoya, Osaka, Kobe, Yokohama. One by one, Japan's great cities vanished beneath waves of fire. By summer, half of Japan's urban area had been destroyed. Factories, rail lines, and shipyards lay in ruins. But more devastating was the psychological toll. Millions were homeless. Food supplies collapsed. The government's promises of victory rang hollow amid the ashes. Yet even as the flames consumed their cities, Japan's leaders refused to surrender. The military still believed that if they could inflict enough casualties on the invading Americans, perhaps a negotiated peace was possible. The emperor's advisors spoke of honor, not defeat. For the airmen of the 20th Air Force, the missions continued without mercy. The B-29 crews flew 14-hour round trips through storms and flak. Many never returned. But with each raid, Japan's ability to fight was collapsing. Still, it was not enough. The Japanese government did not yield. The Allied command began to consider an invasion, Operation Downfall, a plan to land millions of troops on the Japanese mainland. American planners estimated that the cost could be over 1 million Allied casualties and perhaps 10 million Japanese deaths. Then, on July 16, 1945, in a remote desert of New Mexico, the war changed forever. The Manhattan Project, a secret scientific effort stretching from Los Alamos to Chicago, had succeeded. The first atomic bomb had exploded, brighter than the sun, more powerful than any weapon in history. When President Harry T. Truman received the news, the meaning was clear. The United States now possessed the ultimate weapon. The question was whether to use it. By August, the choice was made. If Japan would not surrender, the bomb would force them to. On August 6, 1945, the B-29 Enola Gay lifted off from Tinian. Its payload, Little Boy, a uranium bomb. Its target, Hiroshima. At 8:15 a.m., The bomb detonated 1,900 feet above the city. In a blinding flash, Hiroshima vanished. A firestorm swept outward, incinerating everything within 2 miles. Tens of thousands died instantly. By nightfall, over 70,000 were gone. 3 days later, on August 9th, a second bomb, Fat Man, fell on Nagasaki. Another city destroyed, another 40,000 lives lost. The message was unmistakable. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito addressed his nation for the first time in history. His voice, calm and distant, came over the radio. Japan would accept surrender. The war was over. For the American airmen who had flown over Japan, the end brought relief, but also reflection. The scale of destruction was almost unimaginable. Cities turned to dust, millions displaced. The line between military and civilian blurred beyond recognition. Some wondered whether such destruction had been necessary. Others believed it had saved millions of lives that would have been lost in an invasion. For Japan, the war had ended in ruins, a proud empire reduced to ashes. For the United States, it marked the dawn of a new era, one where industrial might and scientific power had fused into something unstoppable. The skies that had once burned over Tokyo now lay quiet. The bombers were silent, their missions complete. In the distance, across the Pacific, ships began to sail home. The world had entered the age of total war, and total peace would never be the same again.
When the guns finally fell silent in August 1945, the world stood at a crossroads. Cities were in ruins, empires were broken, and millions of lives had been lost. From the ashes of the Second World War, a new global order was about to emerge, one dominated by the same nation that had risen from isolation just 4 years earlier, the United States of America. The war in the Pacific had ended with unprecedented destruction. Japan's once proud empire, which had stretched across Asia and the Pacific, was gone. Its navy lay at the bottom of the sea. Its cities were rubble and ashes. For the first time in its history, Japan faced occupation by a foreign power. American troops landed not as invaders, but as administrators of a defeated nation. General Douglas MacArthur, appointed Supreme Commander for the Allied powers, took control of the reconstruction. His mission was clear: to rebuild Japan, not destroy it. MacArthur's occupation was unlike anything the world had seen before. He preserved the emperor, allowing Hirohito to remain as a symbolic figure to maintain order, while stripping him of political power. A new constitution was drafted, guaranteeing democracy, civil rights, and the renunciation of war itself. Article 9 declared that Japan would forever renounce war as a sovereign right. The Japanese people, weary and starving, accepted these changes with remarkable resilience. The same discipline and unity that had fueled their war effort now turned toward rebuilding their shattered homeland. American aid flowed in: food, machinery, medical supplies, helping stabilize the nation. Within a decade, Japan would rise from the ruins to become one of the most advanced economies in the world. But in 1945, that future was still unimaginable. For the United States, victory brought both triumph and responsibility. The war had transformed America from a regional power into a global superpower. Its economy was untouched by bombing, its industry stronger than ever, its military unrivaled. The atomic bomb had cemented America's dominance, but it had also introduced a terrifying new reality. The mushroom clouds over Hiroshima and Nagasaki marked not just the end of one war, but the beginning of a new age, the nuclear age. The Soviet Union, America's wartime ally, quickly became its post-war rival. The uneasy partnership that had defeated Hitler and Japan gave way to suspicion and fear. By 1947, the world was divided once again, not between Axis and allies, but between East and West. The Cold War had begun. The lessons of World War II shaped every decision that followed. America embraced a new role as defender of democracy, leader of reconstruction, and guardian of the balance of power. The Marshall Plan rebuilt Europe, just as MacArthur's reforms rebuilt Japan. Together, these efforts created a new international order, one based on trade, alliances, and American leadership. At home, the effects of victory were profound. Millions of veterans returned from the battlefields to a nation transformed. The GI Bill gave them education, housing, and opportunity, fueling an economic boom unlike any before. Suburbs expanded, factories retooled, and the post-war generation, the so-called baby boom, began to define modern America. But the cost of victory remained visible in memory and scar. Over 400,000 Americans had died, and countless more were wounded. For Japan, the losses were staggering: over 3 million dead, cities erased, and generations marked by war's trauma. Guadalcanal, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, these names became symbols of sacrifice and endurance. For those who survived, the war never truly ended. The memories lingered, the jungles, the noise, the faces of friends who never came home. Across the Pacific, graves stretched in neat rows, each one a testament to the price of global power. And yet, from that devastation, the modern world was born. Japan and the United States, once mortal enemies, became allies. In the decades that followed, they would build one of the strongest partnerships in history: economic, political, and cultural. The same airfields that once launched bombers would later launch trade and technology. The same seas once filled with warships would carry commerce and cooperation. The Pacific, once the stage for the bloodiest battles in human history, became the foundation of peace and prosperity. But the legacy of the war went deeper still. It forced humanity to confront the consequences of total war: the firebombings, the atomic blasts, the industrialization of death. It proved that science and industry could both save and destroy on a scale previously unimaginable. In the ruins of Tokyo and Hiroshima, a new question emerged: not just how to win wars, but how to prevent them. That question would define the second half of the 20th century. In the United Nations, born from the ashes of the League of Nations, world leaders pledged never again. Yet even as they spoke of peace, the world braced for another kind of conflict, one fought not with armies, but with ideology, propaganda, and nuclear weapons. Still, for a brief moment in 1945, the world exhaled. The war that had begun with the bombing of Pearl Harbor ended with the surrender in Tokyo Bay. Between those two moments lay a story of transformation, of nations, of technology, and of the human will to endure. On September 2, 1945, on board the USS Missouri, Japan signed the formal surrender. American and Japanese officers stood side by side in silence. Above them, hundreds of Allied aircraft flew in formation across the blue sky, a final display of the air power that had defined the war. General MacArthur spoke simply: "We are gathered here, representatives of the major warring powers, to conclude a solemn agreement whereby peace may be restored to the world." His words marked the end of one era, and the uncertain beginning of another. The world that emerged from the Second World War was not the same one that had entered it. Empires were gone, nations were reborn, and at the center of it all stood a new power, the United States, armed not just with weapons, but with an idea that democracy, industry, and unity could reshape the world. The cost was unimaginable. But from that cost, a new age began. And though the guns of Guadalcanal, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa are now silent, their echoes still shape the present, reminders of the moment when the world was remade by fire, and the dawn of a new order began under the banner of peace.